Hey, Divas. We have enjoyed bringing you podcasts week in and week out. And if you've enjoyed listening, please help us keep the lights on here by subscribing to the show and giving us a rating. We'd love 5 stars, but we won't tell you what to do on your favorite podcast platform. Hello, Divas. Very special episode 101 with Governor Jeb Bush. We talk a lot about education reforms and accountability, what he's doing now with education. We talk about honeymoons. Stick around to the very end. We have a very interesting discussion about the death penalty. Please join us for episode 101 with Governor Jeb Bush.
The vitriol and the exaggerating, everybody's a Nazi or a fascist. God dang, man. I mean, lighten up. We can have different views. And trust me, as a conservative, I have differing views in my own party, much less the policies of the other party. But I think there should be a higher degree of civility and respect for people. Because someone has a different view than you, it doesn't mean they're the enemy of anything. They might just be wrong. There should be a higher degree of respect for having a different view.
You're listening to Deeper Dive with Dara, a podcast by the News Service of Florida. Let's dive in.
Hello, Divas. Welcome, welcome. We are celebrating our 100-ish episode with a terrific special guest. I'm so thrilled that he could join us today. Governor Jeb Bush, welcome to A Deeper Dive.
It's a joy to be with you, Dara.
And the reason I say 100-ish is the governor and I tried to connect last week while I was on vacation, and the technical gods were working against me, and so we're giving it another try. I appreciate your patience with this process.
I've learned how to be patient. That was not one of my one of my strengths when I was a youngin'. But I'm more patient now.
Well, I really want to thank you again for doing this. I wanted to go over some of the things that you oversaw, and I want to talk about what you're doing now a little later on, but just kind of a recap for folks. Hanging Chads, Terry Schiavo, 9/11, monster storms, back-to-back years. You dealt with a lot as governor. And of all those issues, which one was your biggest challenge, and what did you learn the biggest lesson from?
Well, I mean, we had a lot of challenges. We forgot one, Florida.
Oh yeah, we'll talk about that. That one, Florida. That's the anti.
One, Florida was a executive order that eliminated the use of race as a criteria for admissions in our universities, and eliminated the set-aside programs and preferential pricing for minority business contractors with the state.
Right, and when I was talking to you last week, I was saying you were anti-DEI before being anti-DEI was cool.
Well, it turns out the Supreme Court has finally ruled that using these tactics instead of fixing the systems to make sure that people of all diversities have an equal opportunity for success. I mean, as a society, I think it's important to create the environment for people to achieve earned success. And Florida's university system now, for the last 20 plus years, has not used race as lowering one standard for one group at the expense of the other. But, look, we have a more diverse student population than we did in the 1990s. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done. It's hard work, though. It's hard to actually improve your high school outcomes so that there are more and more qualified students to be able to go to universities. But I think we're on the right track here. Anyway, that was politically.
You got a lot of pushback from that. A lot.
Yeah, a ton. And interestingly, the pushback happened months after the rollout. It didn't happen immediately. And one of the lessons learned in an experience like that is, if you're doing something big like that, you need to stay completely focused and constantly communicate the benefits of the new way of thinking, the new way of doing things. And we moved on to the next initiative. And when the sit-in took place, there was not enough information really for the broader universe of citizens of the state to fully appreciate and understand what we were doing. It was pretty traumatic because you may remember there, we had a pretty diverse group of men and women working in my administration and in leadership positions. And a lot of them went through very difficult, challenging times because of the raw emotion that this brought out. Largest protest in Florida's history, apparently. In Tallahassee for my State of the State address. We got through it, and it's still today. The executive order still stands.
Well, a lot of people, maybe not a lot, but the perception at the time was that, this was kind of a racist thing to do. And that's a lot of the reaction to some of the efforts to do away with, to restrict, for lack of a better word, the way that African American studies can be taught, to restrict the way history can be taught. The pushback against that is that it's racist to not allow people to tell their stories the way they want to tell them. Am I mischaracterizing the pushback?
One Florida is not relevant to 2024 in that regard. We replaced a system that had one set of standards for one group at the expense of the other. We now have one standard for admissions in our universities, and the effort to recruit a diverse student population to this day continues, and we have more Blacks and Hispanics attending our universities because of One Florida than what we had before. It's a leadership model. It requires work. It required procurement when we had our cabinet secretary meetings, showing who's been successful in creating opportunities for women-owned businesses, Hispanic-owned businesses. But those businesses didn't get a set aside, and they didn't get a 15% discount not discount, 15% lift in their pricing. It was a fair system for all. It required a lot more work, and it required, I think, the key to this was to get a better result, and we did. And to this day, I think Florida benefits from that. So that's not racist at all. That's creating an opportunity society for all. And, in a state as diverse as Florida, I think it's essential that we do this.
I guess where I was going is that was the same criticism, a similar criticism was lobbed against you at the time, because it was a very novel approach, and you had received the backing in your governor's race from some prominent Black ministers. That One Florida effort kind of diminished the goodwill, I think, of some of those folks. I think maybe that was repaired or that was mended by the end of your tenure. I mean, better than I do.
No, I think so, because results matter ultimately. And we had a more diverse student population, and the procurement efforts yielded really incredible results. And people may not, no one's going to remember this, but Ward Connolly was planning to do an initiative in Florida.
I remember.
That I thought he came to my office, and I basically said, look, I support the idea, but the better way to do this is not to have an election that's going to open up old wounds and get people all riled up without necessarily achieving the kind of results you want. He seemed to be quite upset that I didn't embrace the initiative process, but we were working on this One Florida initiative, which I think is a far better way of doing it, because it required a complete change of mindset on how you procure and how presidents of universities create a system where they're working hard to identify high achieving minority students to be able to attend their universities, rather than just lower the standard for one group at the expense of the other, as I said.
We were reminiscing the other day about how I used to work for the Palm Beach Post that you called the Palm Beach Pravda, And you said that was that was the polite name for the Palm Beach Pravda, the one that I'm not going to ask you to say what the impolite name was. But I remember Ward Connerly because this shows you like a throwback to maybe the halcyon days of journalism. We had a reporter. I can't remember if it was at the New York Times regional newspaper group, but I think it was the Palm Beach Post, who actually flew out to California to interview Ward Connerly and see some of what was going on the ground over there. The idea of a reporter, any of us Capitol Press Corps folks being able to fly across the country to report on a story is just sort of like, it shows how long in the tooth I am, I think.
Yeah, I mean, we should talk about that because, but it reminds me of something else, which is California did, through the initiative and referendum process, get rid of affirmative action as they knew it back then, and they had dramatic declines in Hispanic and Black student enrollment. We got rid of affirmative action, and we had an increase in the number of Black students and Hispanic students. So a different approach, better results in Florida because it mattered. And anyway, the press was a thorn in my side. It's a thorn that Governor DeSantis doesn't have to deal with much because the press is effectively shrunk to, you know more about this than me, but it appears like, I mean, the newspapers are skinny if they exist. I read the Miami Herald mostly because of the sports. I want to know what's going on in high school sports and how my beloved Dolphins and the Hurricanes are doing. You don't get your news the same way. And, you know, when I was governor, we had I think 10 daily newspapers show up at 6:30 at the governor's mansion. I mean, I learned a lot of what's going on around the state. And when we screwed up some fashion or we were accused of screwing up in some way, by 7 o'clock, I knew about it. And the press relationship was frustrating for me for sure, but it was important. It kind of created a degree of accountability that doesn't exist today. Or if there is accountability, it's a totally different way of doing it.
Thank you for saying that, Governor, because yes, there was, you did have did you use the word fractious? I'm using the word fractious relationship with the press. There was tension. But in my mind, and I don't know if I'm going to offend you or other people by saying this, not that that ever really bothers me, but it was kind of like a golden era of journalism for us because you talk to us. You know, one of the reasons Governor DeSantis doesn't have to worry about the press so much is not only because we've thinned out, we're a pared down Capitol Press Corps. Of course, he had to deal with the national press when he was campaigning for the White House, but he just doesn't talk to us. His people don't respond to emails unless they want to. You used to come down to the bottom of the stairs on lower level on your way into the cabinet meetings. And not only do they not have cabinet meetings anymore, if they do, they meet by phone. It's going to be repetitive to you, but not to our listeners. I remember many times when you engaged in a mano a mano with Gary Fineout over the FEFP. I mean, you knew these kinds of details we were able to talk to you about because you were knowledgeable about the weeds of government and, I think a self-described policy wonk, and you engaged with us. I mean, let's face it, you were the most conservative thing to hit Tallahassee ever. So everyone was trying to adapt to a new political scheme in Tallahassee. I don't mean scheme in a pejorative way. And yet you engaged with us. And I know that at the time we didn't realize how lucky we were. It sounds like an odd compliment, but it's true.
Look, I don't want to sound nostalgic, but while we had I would say it was a polite adversarial relationship.
That's a better word than fractious. Yes. Thank you.
It was important to keep us on our toes. And kind of in the aftermath of my service, I grew to appreciate the role that you guys played. Probably while I was doing it, I would to be fair about it, I was probably pissed off a lot. But anyway.
Yeah, you're a person. You're a human being.
I never took it personally. It was just, there's a natural tension between what we used to call the fourth estate. Now, I don't think you guys now have an estate status. I think you're like diminished, sadly, to something.
We're the enemies of the people.
Well, I've been reflecting on the near assassination of a presidential candidate, and the terminologies that we use in politics today, we need to figure out a different lexicon. I mean, you can disagree with people, and I disagreed with the Palm Beach Pravda all the time, the editorial board, but you don't have to personalize it. You don't have to like the vitriol and the exaggerating, everybody's a Nazi or a fascist. People are trying to destroy democracy, or they're stealing this. And God dang, man, I mean, lighten up. We can have different views, and like, trust me, as a conservative, I have differing views in my own party, much less the policies of the other party. But I think there should be a higher degree of civility and respect for people. Because someone has a different view than you, it doesn't mean they're the enemy of anything. They might just be wrong. And there should be a higher degree of respect for having a different view.
I blame the internet. I don't blame the internet. I blame Twitter and social media. I think people turn into the worst version of themselves sometimes when they're sitting behind a screen.
The key is that there's you can, I customize how I access news, but I don't customize it like to have all my views validated every day. And I try to encourage liberals to watch Hannity and conservatives to watch Rachel Maddow. And, you may throw something at the television while you're doing it, but you get a different perspective that there's a ton of people in the country that, have a different view than you. And that's okay. It's not the end of the world. But when you customize how you acquire news, and news then becomes, opinion becomes truth or fact, it makes you more righteous about your views, and it makes you less tolerant of other people's views. And that's what we got now. We've got a political environment where we have two tribes that are, don't like each other. And in a hyper polarized world, to your point, social media is exacerbates all of this. Somehow we have to get beyond that.
Do you think, how do we get beyond that? How do you think we fix it?
I don't know. I mean, historically, it's been a crisis that's kind of got people to change their mindsets, but that's a really bad way to organize a change. To have a massive crisis, a financial crisis, or
a 9/11.
A 9/11. These are very traumatic experiences, and in the case of 9/11, it was not long lasting.
Yeah, it was a very brief moment of unity.
I do think people kind of obsess about politics and ignore culture and how we interact with one another. The simple way of describing this is we have 330 million people live in the country. Every day there are a trillion different interactions. And I think we're less kind with one another. We're less honest. We are more vulgar. And as our culture has changed, our politics mirrors our culture. And so ultimately, the way to change our politics is to change how we interact with one another. Again, social media makes that really hard to see how it changes. But we need a cultural change. And culture doesn't change linearly. History is replete of examples of big cultural changes that happen. The last big one probably was the counterculture of the 1960s becoming the dominant culture, and it's run its course. And I think we're kind of at the end of a time in our society where we're ripe for a cultural change, and out of that will come a different politics. That's why I'm relatively optimistic about the future in spite of living in the here and now.
We will be right back with Governor Jeb Bush.
At IEM, our people are our greatest strength. It's our subject matter experts, technologists, and dedicated personnel who make IEM a trusted name professionals depend on when disaster strikes. With 40 years in the emergency management and disaster recovery arena, we have been there to help our neighbors after some of the worst disasters in our nation's history. The homeowners, families, and communities we are proud to serve are no strangers to hardship, and neither are we. Our experts helped write the book on disaster recovery, from leading some of the nation's most extensive housing recovery programs to being a leader in state recovery and emergency management efforts. In the aftermath of catastrophic events, experience matters, and at IEM, we turn our know-how and passion into results.
And we are back with Governor Jeb Bush. You are not running for office, but you are still politically active, right? You have a political committee. Is that yours, or is it affiliated with your... Let's talk about what you're doing now. Let's start with education. That was your legacy, was the A+ plan. Tell us what it did and why you wanted to do it.
This will sound really weird for people that have only experienced politics in the last few years. When I ran in 1998, I actually laid out the A+ plan. I wanted to tell people what I wanted to do. I went to visit 260 schools over a year, which is pretty hard to do if you think about it, since schools aren't open generally in the summer. So I was seeing 3 or 4 schools a day. I was learning a lot. I was showing that I didn't have horns because I had a pretty, people would call it radical view of how we needed to transform our education system. And I got elected, and I'm not sure, the education issue was the number one issue in the campaign for sure. My opponent attacked the ideas I had. And so I declared a mandate, I guess. And we, thanks to Tony Jennings and John Thrasher, we got
former president, former speaker.
The entire A+ package was passed, which was accountability, grading schools based A through F based on learning gains and how students did to the standards. If schools were failing, parents would be given a voucher to go to either a higher performing public school or to a private school. And we rewarded schools that showed improvement with $100 per student direct to the school. And as I said, schools that were graded F had to fix their schools, or the districts were obligated to create an entirely different leadership structure inside the school. And then we ended social promotion in 3rd grade. We focused on early childhood literacy. We trained teachers on how to teach reading. It was a big upheaval, but thankfully the results were really good. I mean, we had really big improvement in reading gains. So Florida was 29th out of 32 states, I believe, on the 4th grade NAEP test. Before No Child Left Behind, not every state administered the NAEP test, Nation Report Card. In 1997, call it, or 1998, we were 29th out of 32. And 4 years later, we were 6th out of 50. So we went from, the bottom of the pack. We were 50th in high school graduation rate. And today we're above, at or above the national average. I think 50% of our kids were graduating from high school in 1998. Can you believe that?
I remember when that data came out, it was shocking.
Yeah, and horrible. And then sadly, half of the kids that did graduate weren't qualified to go to college. They needed remediation.
They needed remediation. Yeah. Yeah.
So, things have really improved because of initially the reforms that we put in place, but thankfully successive governors and legislatures have continued down this path. And now, Florida is a place where people come to steal good ideas in the K-12 space. And I'm, the Excel in Ed, the foundation that was created in 2007, we work in 40 states across the country on not just the Florida initiatives, but many other initiatives to reinvent high school, to really focus on making sure that you have a pre-K to 3 literacy strategy. And then now this acceleration of education savings accounts across the country, where parents are actually in charge of their child's education, and with proper information, they have an array of choices for their kids, which I'm really excited about, because ultimately this should be a child-centered system, not an adult-driven one. So we're the quiet advisors on how to implement some of these big big ideas.
Well, we just did pass the basically universal vouchers in Florida, and there's been some reporting about how parents can spend the money.
Yep.
I think people buying kayaks or spending money on things that you might not think are traditional expenses for K-12 education. What are your thoughts on how that money should be spent and what kind of accountability measures should be included in that?
I think when you do something as big as what Governor DeSantis and the legislature did, which is historic. I mean, we're not the only state that did it, but we were the state that already had more private school options
Mm.
for parents than any state. I
It's a
mean,
big deal and a
it's a
big
huge
state
deal
and a big state.
and a big, complicated implementation
Mm-hmm.
challenge. So whenever you have something like that, there are going to be outliers that you got to deal with, and that's what the legislature did. Once these things came clear, they created, I guess I don't know if they call them glitch bills anymore, but they adapted. There was some there was some financial, like the schools weren't getting money. There was complicated elements of just how to administer the program, and so you never just pass a law and they'd be done with it. There's all sorts of implementation challenges, and if there's, I don't know, the kayak thing, I don't remember the details of that, but there were other examples of things like
Mm-hmm.
that for sure. You narrow the focus and don't allow those things if they're not appropriate. But having said that, Dara, in the public schools, you don't think they piss away money? I mean, this is the argument.
I
we
was a
always have.
substitute teacher back in the day, many, many years ago, before there were iPads and iPhones were a thing as common as they were today. And I was working in the gifted school. They had a gifted program. My daughter was in it. And the teachers were given tablets. And with the tablets came a little what is basically a little voice recorder keychain that you could, just make a short voice recording on. At the time, it was like very novel. And the teachers had no interest in the tablets, but they fell in love with these things that they could make like their little grocery lists on with the keychains. And I'm not disparaging teachers. Teachers are heroes. They're sheroes and heroes in my view. But they were very slow to adapt at that time to adapt to some new technology. And maybe that's just not a very good example of waste and spent. Maybe because my point was the tablets were sat in the closet for who knows how long.
The transformation to a different system is going to have examples of outliers. If it was systemic, then that's a problem. The newspapers do exist and they're still reporting some of this stuff. It's not a systemic problem, it's an outlier, and you fix it. That's all. You constantly are changing how you go about doing things to make the program better. But ultimately, 10 years from now, a parent will be an informed consumer. They'll have an array of information that they'll be able to see. They'll know where their child's weaknesses and strengths are. Through AI particularly, this stuff will be much more available. They'll be given kind of a menu of options to go to the traditional public school, to go to a charter school. Here are the tools that you can use if you want to homeschool. Here are the options for private school. Here are their results. Or if you want to create a hybrid environment where you're doing some of the teaching yourself, and you can go to the public school for a course, or you can, if your kid loves to play basketball, they can be on the basketball team. This is where we're moving, which is parents are empowered and there's an array of choices. And I think that's a far better system than homogenized, one size fits all learning. And the public schools will always play a really constructive role in
I was just going to ask you about that. Do you
definitely, because they have huge advantages in terms of cost, in terms of location, and they'll adapt. They may not have the same level of bureaucracy, but they're going to adapt. And Miami-Dade County is a pretty good example of that. It's probably the best urban school district in the country. And it has 60 to 70% of the parents choose where their kid goes to school. They're not assigned a school. And the school district is recognized, as I said, as the best urban school district in the country. So I'm very optimistic that public schools will play a really important constructive role, but maybe not the bureaucracy, maybe not the unions, but it'll be a 21st century version of what I kind of fought against in the late 20th century.
There's a lot to unpack in what's happened in education over the past 20 years. The expansion of charter schools is one thing. They're public schools. This was something that you initiated. They are public schools, and yet they're sort of treated a little differently in terms of measuring outcomes. Do you think that they get like an unfair? I know this is going to sound like a stupid question, and it is a stupid question. Do they get an unfair advantage? Not really, but we saw what happened with Jefferson County, a charter district. I mean, that went to hell in a handbasket. Is there concern about the operation of some of these charter schools?
Well, just Jefferson County had, I think, the worst education outcomes prior to the district being handed to a charter organization, and it stayed bad. It didn't go from great to bad. It was bad and just stayed bad.
And I think they left them high and dry, right? It's kind of how I remember.
They left them high and dry. Their contract was not renewed, so it went back to a traditional model. Charter schools don't have an advantage. They take all comers. You can't pick and choose who your students are. They get less money in terms of capital outlay, although that's now being, over time, that's been, legislatures dealt with that inequality. They get less money overall per student, but they get the same amount of money of local and state dollars for sure. And if they don't work, they get to be closed down. Public schools can survive being bad in terms of outcomes for the students. All of these options ought to be on the table for parents to choose from. And they'll make the best decision in a really diverse student population, really diverse state. Parents are going to have different needs and different interests for their children. What they need to be, though, are informed parents about where their child stands. Sadly, until the pandemic, I think now parents are more engaged about this. But generally, in the United States, at least, parents thought their kids went to a really good school, but the system was not good. It's kind of like everybody seems to like their congressman, but they think Congress sucks.
Right.
But the fact is, systemically, this is not the right system for the 21st century and the diversity that we have. And now we have the tools to know what are the deficiencies and strengths of our children. And how do you accelerate the great things that your child has the capacity to do? And how do you mitigate the problems? Where are their weaknesses? How do you create a lesson plan as a teacher and a parent to be able to assure that your child gets a year's worth of knowledge in a year's time? We now have these tools that are extraordinary that didn't exist 20 years ago. And if you harness those things the right way and parents have this information, you're going to create the most vibrant, student-centered, focused on outcome kind of environment. And that's where we're moving. And hopefully this will be less, I don't know, this should not be an ideological issue. This is an organizational issue. If we were starting today to say, okay, we don't have a public school system in this country, we're going to create one. We would not create a homogenized, unionized monopoly where politics decides way too much stuff. We would create something that was much more dynamic, where parents are front and center in the core, and where teachers are treated as professionals rather than, units of production that are part of a collective bargaining process.
If we were starting from scratch, is it a good thing for people to be making money off of school education, or is that something that should be a government function? Do you know what I mean? I didn't really word it artfully.
I don't have problems with for-profit entities providing a public role. I don't obsess about that. Don't lose any sleep about it. I'm more interested, though, in assuring that children learn and that we measure this in a transparent way, and that parents make these decisions based on the best needs for their kids. If there's a private provider for tutoring that's a for-profit entity rather than a not-for-profit entity, okay. I mean, that's fine too. To me, it doesn't matter.
The legislature did make some changes. What I think they called it an education deregulation bill this year, and you were very vocal about a proposed change that you actually were able to get out of that measure that would have done away with the third grade testing for moving forward to fourth grade, I believe. Is that?
Yeah, that's to me, if the objective is to eliminate accountability as a measurement of deregulation, then we'll go back to the old way where we have a 50% graduation rate in high school. Maybe we could just get rid of the graduation test too. Why not? I mean, that was the other idea they had, if you recall.
Right.
No accountability means you don't care. If you don't measure, you don't care. You don't give a damn. And
Is it? Do you think that
legislature passed, some legitimate issues regarding the imposition of a bunch of rules on top of the school districts that weren't focused on student achievement? But you take away the gate at the end of third grade, and you're going to have a bunch of functionally illiterate kids going to fourth grade. And the evidence is pretty clear. We have enough data now to know that if you look at the prison population, these aren't highly literate people. These are people who've had, in some cases, limits to access to opportunity. And you have to learn how to read to be able to acquire knowledge from fourth grade on. If you can't read, you can't do math, science, social studies, you can't do anything. To me, it's probably the highest priority is to assure that we have a pre-K to 3 strategy and that we're serious about it, which means, look, we created the no social promotion policy. 30+% of third graders were level 1 readers. So level 1 is below basic. It's the equivalent of functional illiteracy. So a third of our kids on our measurement, which is a lower measurement than the nation's report card. And we created this strategy to have a gate at the end of third grade. And we created a pre-K or K to 3 strategy. We trained teachers on how to teach kids how to read because they didn't know how to do it. We had summer schools. We had all sorts of enhancements to make sure that kids were successful. And that number in the first year, had we done nothing, we would have had a third of our third graders held back. And by the way, Dara, that was my re-election year. It would have been could have been an ugly situation.
Right.
Parents would be quite upset. And it went to, I may be off, but got cut in half to about 15%. And we had a ton of kids held back that first year, and the system adapted and changed, and that number went down to single digits. And the inverse effect was also true, which is we had big gains in grade level readers. So getting rid of that, I thought it was stupid. Now I didn't, you gave me way too much credit in terms of the bill itself. It did not have the support that many of the other elements of a deregulation bill did. And I give credit probably more to Speaker Renner, who has been a phenomenal speaker in my mind, very principle centered. On education stuff, he's in the Hall of Fame.
Well, he was advocated for the education spending accounts. I'm calling them universal vouchers. I think that's listeners might identify with that a little more. As you're making changes to the education curriculum and policy in Florida, what is our weakest pressure point right now? What would you do if you had a magic wand? What would you do to?
I don't know. There's more than one for sure. I think we have to raise the bar. We have to expect more from students. We don't have to expect more from. I think students are capable of rising to the occasion, but systemically, we have to believe that children can do far more than they're doing. And that means not get rid of accountability, but make it more robust. So that would be step number one. I think reinventing high school is probably a place that many states are now trying to figure out how to do. College is not for everyone, but we should have college readiness we have 90% graduation rate. Out of that 90%, maybe half are college ready. Maybe I don't know that for a fact, but it's certainly not 90%. So the aspiration should be college and or career readiness and mean it, which means accelerating the idea of having these credentials embedded into the high school education.
Well, that was something Tony Jennings really was hot for, wasn't she?
Yeah, and Don Gates was a big supporter of this idea. They embedded it in the accountability, the grading of schools.
And Governor DeSantis has made, like, he's advocating you don't need to go to university. You can, and I can tell you, as somebody, any homeowner can tell you, your plumber has 2 beach houses and 4 swimming pools, and your HVAC person is doing better than your plumber. So
plus the AI revolution. That is not gonna. You're not going to have a robot showing up to fix your AC or your plumbing.
Right.
So there's a lot of technology-oriented career jobs as well. So high expectations, and then high school needs to be much more reality-based, which means maybe more work experiences. The state of Indiana's initiated a really dramatic change in high school, where students are not only going to school, but they're also getting work experience. The Bloomberg Foundation is working with hospitals to create high-performing high school charter schools where they're giving work experiences and credentials along the way for nurses, technicians, students that want to, become a radiologist, and all these other things where we have severe shortages. And the students, I think, are going to be much more engaged if it's something that's of interest to them. So having an array of work-oriented, but still in higher quality education that gets to the point where you graduate from high school and you're assured that you're college and career ready. That you pick that pathway rather than being told what what society's makes you. Right now college is really the only alternative for people in their mind. But as you said, there's all sorts of options where people can live an independent, fulfilling life and maybe just get an AA degree or an AS degree or no degree at all with a certificate that guarantees them to get a job that within 2 or 3 years is going to allow them to make $100,000. I mean, that's the world we're in, and our high schools particularly need to be reinvented to be an assistant to allow young people to achieve their dreams.
I know we're running out of time, but I have 2 questions that I wanted to ask. One more education question. What do you think of these challenges to books in school libraries and instructional materials? Is it gotten out of hand, or do you think that it's a good thing?
I'm not knowledgeable about the textbook issues, but the school library issues where parents can intervene and say this book's not appropriate and there's got to be a review of it. I think it's appropriate. The term banning books is not really what's happening in Florida. It's, are you going to allow for elementary schools to have libraries where there is explicit sexual material? And I would say no. I mean, I would say, that might be appropriate depending on the book. It might be appropriate for middle schools or high schools. But that process, I think, makes sense. I don't think parents fully appreciate the kind of, the cultural changes that have happened as it relates to books. Now, if we're banning books because, I can't give you an example, but To Kill a Mockingbird.
Right. Yes.
That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
That I'm not sure. I don't support the banning of classical literature for sure. But let me give you an example of the opposite, which is California last week passed a bill and the governor signed it that said that schools are prohibited to advising parents of their child's
gender identity. Yeah.
Come on, man. So on the one hand, we're all hot and bothered about books that are in elementary schools, library shelves that maybe should be in middle schools. And it's a national tragedy, and on the other hand, where's the outrage for that? Gavin Newsom, I can promise you this, he's not going to run, I bet. But if he was running for president, that would become a huge issue because that's an 80% opposed kind of issue. And a lot of times people get into a bubble, as you said, and they lose sight of the fact that there's certain things they're just shouldn't be doing. That's not the job of, that has nothing to do with gaining a year's worth of knowledge in a year's time.
It's the opposite approach as what Florida has taken, which is they've gotten some heat too. I don't want to spend
This is something. Thankfully, when I was governor,
yeah.
boys were boys and girls were girls. It's gotten a lot more confusing now.
President Biden announced over the weekend, we're recording this on a Monday, President Biden announced over the weekend that he was stepping away from the campaign and endorsed Vice President Kamala Harris. And I'm wondering, you ran for president, so you have a little bit of knowledge about what it's like in that arena. You also come from, you're the scion of a family with two presidents in it, so you're no stranger to White House politics. What do you think of the president's decision, and what do you think is going to happen in November?
I think he made the right decision. I know it was painful for him.
Yeah.
But it was the right thing to do. The reality is that he was going to lose because the guy's impaired. I mean,
his debate performance, I think, really was so.
And then the efforts to remediate the debate performance didn't go well.
No, they. So,
look, from a perspective of he's a Democrat, he's a partisan, he's been doing this, decades. I think the decider was the fact that there could be real down ballot challenges, and his legacy would be impaired. And if you're a progressive, if you're a liberal Democrat, Joe Biden's 4 years have been pretty spectacular. I don't like a lot of the things that were done, but he has a legacy that history will be kind to him. But had he run, I don't think that would be the case. So I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, this is, we're in this hyper partisan, hyper polarized world. Even with the debate performance and all the things that came out afterwards, the polling numbers were still pretty, the race was pretty tight. I mean, President Trump was winning every battleground state, but President Biden wasn't that far behind, which is a reflection, not so much of them, but of the world. We're 45-45, basically.
Yeah. And I think.
And now there's 10% that matter, maybe less than that in those, and that's 10% out of 7 states. So,
do you think Donald Trump,
what the outcome will be?
Will you vote for Donald Trump?
I'm not going to tell you how I'm voting.
Okay, I respect that, but I'm doing my job.
Secret ballot. Secret ballot.
Will you endorse him then? How's that?
Same answer.
Same answer. It's a challenging time to be a Republican too in some circles. You were considered the most conservative thing, as I said, to hit Tallahassee. Do you think you could get elected today as a conservative in Florida statewide?
True traditional conservatives, I think they still can get elected statewide. Yeah, I'm not going to be one of those.
Okay, let's have a little fun here as we wrap up. Again, thank you so much for doing this. What's on your bucket list?
What's on my bucket list? I had my major bucket list item was renewing my vows with my wife. We had our 50th wedding anniversary in February.
Congratulations.
I took my family to San Miguel de Allende in a beautiful chapel. And my precious little Samantha was the ring girl, and Jack and Prescott were the acolytes, and Georgia and Vivi did the readings. And
are those your grandchildren? Are those your grandchildren? Yes. Your grands? Okay, participated.
I got 5 grandkids, and they all participated. That was definitely on my highlight reel. The second one, which I'm embarrassed to say, I thought I was going to rectify, but then my wife changed her mind, was to go on our honeymoon. I have not had a honeymoon with my wife of 50 years.
Wow.
So I gotta go on my honeymoon some point here. I was going to go to Barcelona with her, and for whatever reason, we couldn't do that. So that's on the bucket list for the next year. I got to surprise her somehow and go someplace pretty cool.
Was there a reason why you didn't have a honeymoon when you got married 50 years ago?
I was working and I was in school.
I
got out of school in 2.5 years, and I was working as well. I didn't want to quit my job. I mean, I guess I could say every day's a honeymoon, but we haven't had a formal.
She needs a trip. Yeah.
I haven't been alone with her for like 7 days.
Oh, that'll be a wonderful thing for you.
I mean, other than being home, but
yeah,
everything outside the family. I mean, there's all sorts of things I'm sure that I could put on a list, but they don't matter as much. family matters to me a lot.
Do you have any regrets? Is there anything that you regret in your political career after all these years that you wish you'd done differently or better, perhaps?
Oh, there's a lot of things that I wish I could have done better or finished, for sure. I'll say the one thing that I had some regrets would be dealing with the death penalty in our state.
You're a devout Catholic, right?
Yeah, I mean, I got the moral considerations for sure,
Right,
but it's also the fact that, there are people on death row that are never going to be executed because
right.
they may have an IQ that when they were convicted was accepted, that we would allow someone with a very low IQ to get the death penalty.
That's
Today, we
right.
don't do that.
Right.
Or had a majority vote for the death penalty conviction rather than a unanimous vote. And on some levels, it's delaying justice. I mean, there's a moral implication for sure as a Catholic. It's very hard for me to be part of the death penalty process. I was very uncomfortable with it
I'm sure.
but I had a duty. I mean, I was duty bound to do it, and I did my job. But I think the whole system has been so tangled up by court rulings that it's not a deterrent as it should be. It's expensive.
Hmm.
And, look, I mean, it's one of those things that would be really unpopular probably to do, but figuring out a way to reform the system, given the existing laws that we have now, I think would be appropriate. And my last year, I certainly considered it. I kind of ran out of time to do it. That would have been the proper time to do it, is the end of your tenure rather than the beginning.
Do you think we should do away with the death penalty in favor of life in prison without parole? Some people think that's harsher punishment.
I've heard that argument, and I understand that argument. It's also less expensive.
Yeah, it's cheaper.
And it does create certainty for families that have suffered. I met a lot of families that have had, you can just look at them and see the sadness that they live with by having justice not be, if you have a life imprisonment sentence and you know it's done.
Right.
Or if you're going to have the death penalty, make sure it's not 25 years or 30 years. It's absurd that we've had this tangled up, and it's, frustrating for people to administer it. So
do you think it should be unanimous? Because we've gone away from the unanimous recommendation.
I do. For the most atrocious of crimes.
I have witnessed executions, Governor, and I will say that it's traumatic, even just being an observer, let alone the gravity of being the person who signs the death warrant and is on the phone when...
Look, I have enormous respect for the folks that are in this process, the governor's office, certainly the warden, and those that are part of this, the witnesses, play a role as well. It was a difficult part of my job for sure, and frustrating because policy-wise, it can be a deterrent, I think, but it's not a deterrent today.
Governor Jeb Bush, it has been a delight chatting with you and seeing you. Thank you so much for joining Deeper Dive. I really, really thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Congratulations on 100-ish podcasts. That's great.
Thank you, Governor. Hope we talk again soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to Deeper Dive with Dara, a podcast by the News Service of Florida, hosted by News Service senior writer Dara Cam and produced by me, Mike Exline. Music for the podcast was recorded by Periodic Labs, LLC. To tell us what you'd like to hear, what you've thought about the podcast so far, or even just mention how awesome we are, we have a new email address and we'd love to hear from you.
That's right. We'd love to hear from you. Email us at podcasts with an S at e.newsserviceflorida.com. I know it's a mouthful, but it's podcasts with an S at e.newsserviceflorida.com.